Welcome to Educators podcast. Today we have a very special guest in our studio, Professor Victoria Brazil from Gold Coast University Hospital. Now, Vic Brazil doesn't need any introduction, but just to give you a brief intro, Vic is a very well-known and elegant public speaker, very experienced simulation educator, and social media maestro. But more importantly, she is a very humble personality and is always there to help upcoming educators like myself. So, welcome, Vic.
Thanks very much, Swapnil. It's a pleasure to be here with you and exciting to be at the start of what I understand is a relatively new venture with your podcast. So, keen to see how we go.
Thank you. So, today, Vic is going to share with us her insight into this topic, which is very dear to her heart. That is, how to get started with simulation based educational program. Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay, so there are a lot of budding educators are out there who are very eager to start simulation-based education program for their learners. Now, this is like a buzzword for this decade in education, simulation-based education. However, there is not much guidance for new educators about how to start. Can you please share some of the pearls of wisdom with us?
Yeah, thanks, Swapnil. I think it's probably not really rocket science because it's probably like learning any new body of knowledge and skill set. And there's going to be a combination of some formal learning and some informal learning. I do think being human beings and parallel with our clinical careers, it's that informal learning and being apprenticed to other people that do it that can often have the biggest impact because that's really a touch and feel kind of experience. And I think formal learning complements that, but it's hard really for much of that to make an impact until you've been out there and getting your hands dirty and having a go. So my thoughts really are for newbies. It's often worth going and finding some people who are doing this and one way or another attaching yourself to them, whether that's literally for a week or a day or for a series of days and watch what they do. Not with the idea that everything they will be doing will be right, but just to give you a lie of the land about what people are up to. So, for instance, we at Bond actually have a 7-week elective for our medical students to come and participate in simulation education. And I'm astounded at how quickly they pick up a lot of the things that we do. They're very useful. And then I think it gives them a thirst for the formal learning, and I can direct them whether it's to papers, podcasts, or even short courses in simulation. So I think it's a combination of seeking out just some experience with some people that are doing it, and then also having some nice direction about where to go for that structured formal learning. I think the other thing I'd say is at this early stage, it's good to be really rigorous in thinking what's simulation for. And I think very often, probably myself included, at an early stage got very enthusiastic and thought, sim's great, what can I do with it? Instead of thinking, well, hang on, what's my role as a simulation, as an educator, as a quality improvement person, as a clinician, and thinking, how can I appropriately draw simulation into my work, but not slavishly so. So I think really looking rigorously at where does sim fit into the work I do rather than just thinking, I'll get good at sim and then everything will be sim.
Great. I think that's really good pearls of wisdom. And I think definitely they're quite useful for all of us. One of the other common theme that I came across is everybody gets terrified with this idea of securing the funding. Now, there is a notion that if you don't have funding, you can't start. And everybody wants to start big. They want to make an impact. And so how did you navigate this problem in your career?
Sure. Well, I'm probably a little bit atypical, really, because very early in my career, which was 2003-4, someone at the place where I was working was trying to start big and building a big simulation center and had a lot of money to start with. Strangely enough, that actually turned me away because I didn't see what the educational ethos of that organization was. And so actually I invested some of my own money in buying a SimMan and with a group of friends and colleagues essentially set up our own private business going and doing simulation work for others that needed it. And I'm not necessarily saying I would recommend that to everybody. As it turned out, we were quite successful with that, but I think that's definitely a high risk strategy to get yourself upskilled and to start yourself off. But what it did for me was it meant I had to get good at all the aspects of simulation very quickly, very early, including the technical aspects, the educational aspects, the making a business case, catering to customers, having to make sure that people were getting value for their money. So, in fact, it was a very rigorous discipline very early on in my simulation career. I think to sort of maybe answer that question more generally for people who are working in either universities or hospital systems, you're right. I don't think it's going to be common that you're going to just be given a big windfall of money. Unfortunately, more commonly, you'll often be given a sim man and then nothing much to help you use it. So I think that really comes down to the idea of thinking about how you pull sim into your program. And of course, whatever you're doing at the moment, whether it's explicit funding or not, has some resources behind it, even if it's just our own time. And I think the idea then about drawing simulation in through borrowing equipment or buying equipment, definitely collaborating with others so that you can go and help each other when you're running simulation sessions, thinking about options like simulated patients that might be a relatively smaller cost in the short term, and just thinking a little bit creatively about how do I start doing this, getting good at it before I can really make a case for what it is I want to do. I find that big chunks of money, when I've come across them, have generally not been that hard to find if there was a really compelling rationale about why I wanted to do something and about some clarity about what we thought we were going to achieve with it. But in fact, that can be very hard to come by when we're just starting off and we're not really sure where we're going. So I'm not really one for the sort of big splash to begin with anyway. I think start doing it and then think about the aspirations from there.
Oh, great. Thanks for that. And what sort of team do you think is necessary to start with? Is there any magic number that you need that many team members to start with, or what's your advice?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Again, harking back to those early days, we used to have a team sometimes of two, more preferably of three, so that we could have someone more technical, someone more operational, and someone more educational. That was our ideal team to sort of take away on a weekend workshop. Now at the Gold Coast, we have a team of 3, 4, or 5 on some of our simulations, but more usually there's 2 or 3 people. And I think I now think about it quite differently in that at our institution, we have a small full-time team of simulation educators, but I really like to think that all the medical and nursing and some of the allied health educators in the hospital are part of our virtual simulation service. And so a lot of what we do as the sim team is help other people deliver their own simulations, because I think that actually is the answer. It's not about having a team that goes and runs sims in your organization independently. It's actually about helping the people who actually know their learners best deliver the kind of training that you as a simulation expert will be able to help them design best to achieve those learning outcomes. So I do think small teams are good. I think if I was running some of the simulation centers that I see around the world that have many, many staff, you'd probably be all consumed just with administering those things. Whereas it is, I think we've got a nice sized team, which makes for a manageable sort of budget, as it were. And but we've very much done that with the idea that our role is not to deliver all the simulation, but rather to help other people deliver theirs.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is probably the quality matters rather than the quantity.
Yeah, I think the quality and also the strategy. You know, what do you think that team does? And are they people who do all the sims, or are they people who help other people achieve their educational goals? So yes, quality, and the people I work with are especially good at both technical, educational, and operational things. But I think strategy is critical too.
Okay. Now, moving on to say, if I have a bunch of enthusiastic team members and they want some formal training, what are the options out there for me to train my team members?
Sure, I think I get asked this question a fair bit, and I've got a couple of answers, I suppose. The principle of it comes down to, are you training individual people to deliver simulation, or are you serious about building institutional capacity? And I have sort of probably come to appreciate this distinction a lot more in recent years, partly because I saw people who had money going off to expensive courses and then coming back and finding that they couldn't use the skills they'd achieved because their simulation program at their institution was much more immature. And so they were walking around going, when do I get to show off my brilliant debriefing skills? But, there was no plan as to how simulation was integrated into the institution's educational quality improvement. There were no technical folks. There wasn't good systems for how simulation was delivered. That said, I think it's still a good idea to have individual upskilling, and there's excellent things like the NetSim program. Monash runs some excellent courses as well. So these are things where people can either do stuff online or go through a more in-depth kind of 1, 2, 3 or 4 day program. Obviously, if you're really keen, you can go over to Boston to the Centre for Medical Simulation or to MARTA for one of their courses. So there's nothing wrong with these things, but I think the other strategy that needs to be done in parallel is to think about the so-called institutional capacity building. And I'm doing some work with a hospital up the coast in Queensland, and also Jesse Spur and I have done some work with another hospital and health service combined with the university in Dunedin, where we've actually gone there, done some work around some of those institutional capacity issues, and then also run workshops, but with people who are brought together from the institution to go through the same learning process. So then you capitalize on a lot more networking, thinking about exactly what is the context in which they'll be delivering that simulation education, and also thinking how to, what really are the objectives of the institution, rather than each sort of area in the hospital running off in their own direction, doing their own thing. So I think for me, that's the sort of higher aim of simulation faculty development, is to really consider it an institutional capacity building exercise.
Sure, and I'm kind of grateful to you because you conducted the faculty development workshop a couple of years ago in St. George, and that was really quite success, and that helped us to kick off our simulation program off the ground, and it kind of now flourishing quite well. So yeah, absolutely. I think having experts around within your locality, that always helps, and I think tapping them in that resource is quite useful. So
Just to sort of add to that, I think one of the strategies, in addition, that they're doing very well up at the Sunshine Coast University Hospital, is establishing mentoring relationships between people who've done more simulation versus more nascent simulation educators, and pairing them up. So the idea that they might go along and do some debriefing feedback for those folks, or help them run their sims the first couple of times. And I think that's actually a really good strategy within an organisation as well, is to set up some mentoring pairs.
that's very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Now, I was listening to one of your simulcast episodes on research about measurable learning outcomes. Often, many people become educators as they don't like research, and it's kind of mandatory to develop or think about research while you're setting up the simulation program, because you need to go back and prove to your organization that this sim program is working. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's important to make a distinction here about whether you want to engage in research, or whether, as you phrased it, you want to demonstrate the value of what it is that you're doing in simulation. I think the latter is absolutely mandatory. If you can't articulate the value of what you're doing as a simulation educator, or indeed as any kind of health professional educator, then I think it's pretty hard to imagine that people can continue to support the resources that those programs take. That said, I don't think all of us are going to be true researchers in the meaning of the word, and investigating things with the rigor that research takes. So obviously there's a crossover, and many things that we do by way of evaluation to demonstrate our value also may be completely valid research or scholarship related to our practice of simulation. So I think, yes, you must think about evaluation, and there's a variety of strategies for doing that. Most of the good ones do not involve Likert scales, asking the learners whether they liked it or not. Please don't anyone use that as a useful form of evaluation. It actually is hard to do well, and I see people whose full-time jobs are thinking about evaluation of educational interventions in their institutions. But I think everybody should be thinking, what am I doing? What difference does it make? how can I demonstrate that? And I think there's a variety of ways. And then I think most people should aim to have some kind of scholarship associated with the work they do if they're serious about their simulation education, because I think that just makes you more reflective and more inclined to really question what you're doing all the time. So by scholarship, I don't mean you have to do a massive resource-intensive trial involving many participants in simulation. It just means going through those classic criteria for scholarship. Is it something important to the learners? Have you thought about it critically? Have you reflected upon it? And so the idea of then disseminating through areas like even social media, it doesn't have to be in the Lancet, I think is not a bad idea at all. So yes to scholarship, definitely to evaluation and demonstrating value, and a maybe to research, depending on your skill sets and your interest.
Okay, so that's kind of a nice segue into this next question about the learner-centered program, which is kind of aimed at improving the patient's safety. Now, how a new or young educator can achieve this balance, and how he can or she can demonstrate that to his or her boss?
So it's tricky. And once again, I think it comes down to people being rigorous about what it is that they're trying to achieve with their simulation. And many of the great strategies to achieve patient safety outcomes actually don't involve education. And that's an uncomfortable truth in the simulation world and indeed in the education world. If your aim is to run a learner-centered education program, and I'd take, for example, the work we do, say, with our medical students at Bond University, then I think there are well-described strategies about how to make things learner-centered, which does not mean easy for learners or just well-liked for learners, but rather really focused well upon the needs that they have for learners. But I think your question really results around the idea of we actually want to improve outcomes for patients. We actually want to create safe and efficient care. And I think in order to do this, sometimes we clinician educators are guilty of making assumptions about what that means. And in fact, we don't have sufficient depth of knowledge or understanding or perspective in the issues in patient safety. We think it's just about, well, we'll train as a team, we'll do closed loop communication, and hey presto, our teamwork will be better. If you delve into patient safety literature, it's more complex than that, surprise, surprise. And I'd recommend, for instance, Chris Hicks's article, The Human Factor here. I'd also recommend a lot of the work by Jeffrey Braithwaite and his Resilience 2.0 or Safety 2.0 and his work in resilience and complexity, his white paper here, and a whole range of authors who I think are really teaching us to understand that we need to think about patient safety differently to the way we have. And I think if you're going to be an educator in this field, you've got to have some depth of knowledge, of understanding about those contemporary issues in patient safety, which, like it or not, is going to take a fair bit of reading, a little bit of exposure. Although if you listen to the podcast that we did on Simulcast with Peter Diekman, that gives a nice insight into that as well. So, as I said, sort of an uncomfortable truth, but if we're going to be interested in an area, we probably have to know about it.
Fair enough, and that's a quite valid point. And I think I strongly recommend that the podcast with Peter Diekman. That was really great podcast, and I really enjoyed that. So coming to the last question, one of the important aspects of successful simulation program is sustainability. Now, how do you think one can achieve that sustainable simulation education program?
So once again, I think this is a lot to do with the strategic decisions that we make about the place of simulation in either our education or quality improvement within our organisations. So I think it's an argument for simulation being as embedded as possible within your, say, hospital or university. I'll speak about that from a hospital point of view. It's one of the reasons I like having a small and nimble simulation service, because it means that, in fact, our simulation program extends much more widely, and it involves many nursing and medical educators in their departments doing simulation work. And as such, it becomes sustainable because it becomes a skill set that the organisation has, rather than either a place or a group of educators that are hanging off funding next year. And that's, again, a sort of difficult to set up. But I think if you start out with that strategy, then I think it's more likely to be perpetuated because you've essentially built up a much deeper capability within the organization. I suppose the one thing I would say is, of course, not always should things be sustainable. It may be that the priorities of an organisation change and differ, and sometimes simulation programs might need to adapt in order to achieve that. So, and then again, for educational institutions, I think it's different again. So, certainly, if you're at a university, in some ways, you're probably safer because there's a very core educational mission, say, of our medical school that says, you have to be good at these outcomes, and simulation can be a very effective way of doing it. So, I suppose, like some of my other answers, it comes back to think hard about how you're doing it, and then the sustainability might just follow.
Okay. And Vic, I'm just going to ask you your kind of advice for young educators who are starting their career as an educator in health profession.
You mean where to start in terms of how to get good at it?
Yes, that's right. Or to become Vic Brazil.
Well, I don't know if you want to do that, but I think, we've thought about this recently, and we just published a paper this week on medical education registrars. So for 10 years, I've been supervising people who are in parallel with their clinical training, doing either a 6 or 12-month attachment in either medical education or simulation. And it's just been fascinating to watch the progress of those people over the years. And I think that idea of having a really solid exposure for a good period of time, like 6 or 12 months, in parallel with your clinical training, has really worked well for most of those people. That said, I think I've got better at supervising them too. I think the things that I do now are much more effective than the things I did 10 years ago because, of course, not surprisingly, I've been on a learning curve too about how to help them both get the lingo of education, get the principles and the knowledge around education, but also just get a bit of a mindset, which is about how do you lead change in a department or in an organization. I think that actually is one of the other learning objectives that those groups had. So I would suggest to those young educators, find an opportunity to do some kind of dedicated attachment. That wasn't there when I started, but I did go and spend 4 months at Stanford as a visiting fellow. I also then did the Harvard Macy program in 2005, and that really revolutionized my perspectives on it. But I think anything where you can go and attach yourself to someone and have a bit of a deep dive into the med ed world is a good start. I think the next thing to do is to also make sure you're collaborating with some non-clinician educators. And I was really lucky. I've worked with some great medical education officers over the years, and certainly in the university with a lot of people who've got more primary educational background. And those people are just incredibly valuable for those of us who are clinicians to get another view on how we think about what it is that we do. And then I guess the last thing I'd say is, read voraciously, get involved in conversations, go to conferences like AMI or ANZAFI or any of a number of other med ed conferences or simulation conferences if that's your particular area, and get immersed in those conversations, because those sorts of discussions are then going to leverage any of the skills that you have. And then maybe, like you, Swapnil, start a podcast where you then interview a bunch of people and get a whole new bunch of ideas.
Well, I kind of learned quite a lot from you even just watching you. And I think this is just probably beginning, but I guess this, as you mentioned, this is quite a steep learning curve as an educator. And I think if you have a role model in front of you, that helps quite a lot. So I hope that kind of will help our other educators out there. And I hope, guys, you will learn quite a lot from Vic Brazil. Vic, if they want to contact you, what's the best contact details for you?
Yeah, sure. I'm always happy to talk to people about anything to do with their simulation or education careers. So you can email me, vbrazil@bond.edu.au, or if anyone wants to send me a direct message on Twitter, I'm there at SocraticEM. So happy to be contacted either of those ways, and happy to chat about any of these things.
Thanks, Vic. Thanks a lot.
My pleasure.